One of the key weapons of the United States Navy during World War II was the development of what would become known as the Fast Carrier Task Force. This fleet of ships centred around between 4 and 6 aircraft carriers, complemented by specialist support vessels, and a large screening force of up to 20 destroyers. As its name suggested, the task force was developed with speed in mind, with the carrier element representing a highly mobile and surgical strike force. Capable of launching hundreds of adaptable fighter-bomber aircraft, it could inflict severe damage on enemy targets, both on land and at sea. These same aircraft being able to work alongside the escorting destroyers, minimising the possibility of any successful Japanese counterattack. Originally attached to the US Fifth Fleet, the Fast Carrier Force was designated Task Force 58 under the leadership of Admiral Raymond Spruance. The decision was later made in August of 1944 to transfer it to the Third Fleet, redesignated as Task Force 38 under the leadership of Admiral William Bull Halsey. 3 months later, Halsey would lead these ships into the Battle of Lake Gulf and would come under criticism from his superiors for hesitating in battle. His failure to secure the San Bernardino Strait, perceived as having allowed a Japanese fleet to attack the US landing forces and escape the battle relatively unscathed. This criticism would have a deep and profound effect on Halsey, and tragically, also for the men under his command in Task Force 38. Following a 10-day period of repair and resupply on the Ulithi Atoll during November of 1944, Task Force 38 was then ordered to support amphibious landings in the Philippines. Eager to push back against what he perceived as the stinging and unfair criticism he'd faced, Halsey pushed the ships and the men under his command to their limits. The size of his task force having now swollen to over 90 vessels, centred around a core of 13 aircraft carriers with over 50 escorting destroyers. Between the 13th and the 16th of December, this huge force pounded the Japanese defences around the island of Mindoro, destroying countless enemy aircraft and ships. In doing so, ensuring that only minimal airborne opposition was experienced by the landing forces, commanded by General George MacArthur. After withdrawing from the battle, Halsey was then ordered to conduct a further 3-day strike, starting on the morning of December 19th, to support American landings at Luzon. With some of the escort ships in the task force having been reduced to as low as 10% of their fuel, he then gave orders for the ships to proceed to a point 500 miles east of Luzon in order to refuel. But as the destroyers began to approach the capital ships to attach fuel lines, Halsey received notification from his meteorological officers of an approaching tropical depression. Determined to keep to the strict timeline imposed on him by MacArthur, Halsey elected to disregard this information, ordering for the operation to continue. But as the destroyers attempted to refuel, the barometers on each ship began to fall sharply, whilst at the same time, the waves battering their hulls increased to dangerous levels. With conditions having deteriorated to a point where the fuel lines could not successfully remain attached, Halsey was eventually forced to suspend the action, ordering that the fleet change course from its westerly track and instead head south in the hopes they could again attempt to refuel on the morning of 18th December. Not realising as he did so, the approaching weather system had now developed into a full-blown tropical storm, which had been designated as Typhoon Cobra, and he had unwittingly just ordered his task force to sail directly into the heart of it. As the skies became continually darker and the incoming waves grew ever higher, the sailors of Task Force 38 realised their commander had made a mistake. Even aboard his flagship, the imposing USS New Jersey, Halsey himself could feel the effects of the 90-knot winds that sent his crew and their equipment tumbling across the decks. But the discomfort he felt was nothing compared to the suffering experienced by those crewing the smaller ships in the fleet, with some of the escort destroyers listing up to 70 degrees to one side in the swell, their crews praying each time the ship would somehow right itself. As the various ships in the fleet lost visual contact with one another amidst the developing melee, the damage they sustained grew worse and worse. Aboard the destroyer USS Alwyn, the ship's mast suddenly split and cracked in two, with half of the metal tower plunging down, smashing a massive hole into the decking. More horrifying still, on her sister ship, the USS Dewey, The crew watched on in horror as the battering waves resulted in the ship's depth charges breaking free from their restraints, tumbling past the sailors, off the deck into the raging seas alongside them, with little more than fate to stop them from impacting back into the ship's hull and detonating. The immense size of the task force's aircraft carriers offered the men there no protection either, as the ship's severe list allowed waves to impact up and across the lower decks, tearing the planes that had been secured there free from their restraints, sending them crashing into the seas, or worse, colliding into their neighbouring aircraft. Aboard the USS Cowpens and the USS San Jacinto, men who had run to try and re-secure the aircraft were swept out into the seas, with the USS Kwajalein temporarily losing her own steering control. But the worst of the carriers to suffer was the USS Monterey, where several fully fueled aircraft collided and detonated, causing a major fire to spread throughout the ship. Aboard her, fire crews desperately battled to extinguish the flames, future US President Gerald Ford amongst their number, before the blaze could consume the entire vessel. But with the huge carrier rolling up to 20 degrees from side to side, this proved near impossible, causing her captain to order the engines be slowed to try and stabilise the ship. Minutes later, the matter was taken out of his hands, the fire causing a complete power failure, leaving the helpless aircraft carrier wallowing directly in the path of her escorts. As the mounting waves continued to smash into the helpless naval vessels, the death toll mounted, men crushed to death under falling equipment or washed overboard into the sea. But nowhere would more lives be lost than amongst the poor souls stationed aboard the 8 Farragut-class destroyers assigned to escort the fleet. Constructed in 1934, the Farraguts were larger and faster than previous incarnations, but their crews complained the ship suffered from significant stability issues. In the wake of the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Farraguts had undergone a major refit, with up to 500 tons of additional armament being put in place aboard them. Now, they stood little chance of recovering from the severe lists and rolls the battering sea subjected them to, a predicament made even worse by their fuel situation. Having been able to fully refuel, the USS Spence, Hickox and Maddox had been ordered to counterballast their fuel tanks with seawater and tried to move close into the bigger ships. But for some reason, the crew of the Spence had either been unable or unwilling to do so. Several hours into the chaos, the ship's rudder suddenly jammed hard to starboard. Steaming helplessly in a huge circle, the ship was then consumed by an immense wave, flooding her smokestacks and disabling her. There would be only one outcome, the battering waves then capsizing the helpless destroyer, with only 23 of the 300 men aboard her, making their way off the sinking ship. Not far away, the crew of a second Farragut-class destroyer, the USS Dewey, were also experiencing steering problems. With no controls working on the bridge, her crew were forced to steer the wallowing destroyer from the engine room, following orders passed down through the body of the ship. The bucking and pitching vessel careened directly into the path of the helpless USS Monterey, the carrier still also lacking the ability to steer because of her power failure. The destroyer's crew staring up in pure horror as the larger ship's flight deck towered directly above them, the drifting carrier's hull passing only a few hundred metres away by them. Sadly, for the crews of a further 2 of the Farragut destroyers, there would be no such lucky escape. Peering out into the darkness, lookouts on the USS Hull could only watch on in terror as the quarterdeck of the USS Monaghan suddenly materialised out of the storm, directly in front of them. The resultant collision completely shattered the bow of the hull, leading her to capsize minutes later, barely a quarter of her 200 crew making it to her life rafts. The damage to the Monaghan would prove even more catastrophic, sending the destroyer immediately down underneath the waves, leaving only 6 survivors. The men in the water, experiencing sheer hell, as the storm continued to rage all around them, and the rest of the task force sailed on, away from them. As the weather conditions finally started to abate on the afternoon of 18th December, Admiral Halsey signalled Pearl Harbor to advise of what had taken place, reporting he'd sustained an unknown amount of damage and casualties, and would now not be able to support the planned landings at Luzon, at the same time issuing orders to his fleet, now spread across an area of 2,500 miles, to return to the Uthili Atoll. As he did so, The fleet's lack of communications meant he didn't know the scale of the disaster, including the loss of the 3 Farraguts. It would only be by a pure quirk of fate the task force would learn this, and that the mounting death toll would not climb far higher. The badly damaged USS Tabora had been trying to limp clear of the dwindling storm when it encountered one of the survivors of the hull. Defying orders from Halsey to return to base, Commander Henry Lee Plage instead remained in the area, stubbornly cruising back and forth pulling men from the water, spending the next 51 hours recovering a total of 55 sailors from the trio of sunken destroyers, only agreeing to cease his search when 2 other ships were dispatched to take over from him, who in turn would recover a further 13 more survivors. Plage would later be awarded the Legion of Merit by Halsey, with the rest of his crew the first to be awarded the ribbons for a Navy unit commendation. But despite this heroism, the losses sustained by the task force were shocking. Over 140 aircraft had been destroyed, and 790 men had lost their lives. To many in the US Navy, it felt as if the Typhoon itself had been what the Japanese referred to as a kamikaze, or a divine wind, somehow managing to inflict far worse damage on the American fleet than the namesake attacks of the Japanese Air Force. A court of inquiry, chaired by Admiral Chester Nimitz, would spend the final week of December hearing the testimony of those involved, finding that Halsey's interpretation of the weather warnings, his orders and his actions were directly responsible for the tragedy, but agreeing that such a unique set of circumstances meant it was not appropriate for any punishment to be imposed upon him. Rather than sanction, Nimitz's focus fell upon improvement, demanding additional, experienced meteorological officers be attached to each and every US fleet, and that further to this, multiple weather reconnaissance planes and weather ships be placed at the disposal of the Pacific Fleet, so that the risk of any further US sailors dying as a result of avoidable weather conditions could be minimized as much as possible.